All right, let's go ahead and get started by going through the frequently made mistakes that I've seen so far for assignment 2A. This is the next round of frequently made mistakes feedback. As always, it's extremely important that you address these issues in your submissions, which are due at the end of this week. Otherwise, they will simply not be reviewed. So make sure everything that's in here is something that you address, even if that means going through one at a time, watching the discussions, and going looking at your code to see if you have this problem. So first thing, please make sure that you do not have string literals like this. It's probably okay to do something like that, although I would prefer to have a string literal for that. But don't be doing stuff like this. Instead, you want to do something like get movies or whatever the particular symbolic constant is that is in your constants.java file. So make sure that you do that. This is something that should be second nature by now because I really push on this a lot, not to have hard-coded string literals because it makes your code very brittle when you start making changes in the client and server side. Down here, there's something very important that's missing. If you take a careful look, you'll see that this particular example is using the path approach, and so you need to make sure you add the search path. Also down here, make sure you don't use query because this is a path, so make sure you use that correctly. This is something I think that should have been handled properly if you were to use the ChatGPT approach that we had talked about to do the generation of the database API from the controller. So if you're not having that experience, let me know, but I think that should have done it properly. Down here, there's something else missing here. This depends on how you do it, of course. If you make search query, have a slash at the beginning, then this is not a problem. If you don't have search query, have a slash at the beginning, then you need to do something like this. So make sure you have a slash in there. Once again, don't be using query here, be using path. Down here, same problem, depending on how you implement search query. This may or may not be an issue. Down here, once again, don't use query, use path. And then finally, this one's interesting. This is a post, and for post, you're supposed to use a different annotation. Once again, don't use @query here. So I'm not quite sure what was going on, but I think people were just being kind of careless. Try to see if ChatGPT will make your life easier. I think it probably will, but let me know if it doesn't. So now let's focus on some issues with the code that uses these mechanisms. So this, of course, is code that's going to be the code that's the proxy code, like the database sync proxy.java file. And here, once again, if you watch the case study that we go over, I have a very specific way of doing this. It uses the call utils execute call method. Very clean, very, very clear. Don't try to get cute and fancy and make your code incorrect, but instead make sure that you're using the techniques that we talked about in those videos. That's why we have the videos, so that people can see how to do it and use it as a model or a pattern. Down here's the get timings issue again. Make sure that you don't make changes to the skeleton, but instead it should look like something along these lines. There should not be a parameter here. And down here, you should use the appropriate constant that designates the timer service that's in the constants.java file. And the reason for this, of course, is because the timing microservice, there's only one timer microservice. You never have to select between them. So there's no need to parameterize this method up here. Whereas for the database API stuff, there is a need to do that because we're going to have different database services over time, different microservices. So we want to be able to parameterize the route name so the client doesn't have to change when we go to select a different implementation of the database microservice. Down here, yet another problem. Don't start expanding the code in line and then do it in a half-baked way. This is already handled correctly through the technique that actually this person used in database sync proxy, so they were just getting overly confused for reasons that sort of mystify me, but make sure you don't do that. Use the call utils class and refactor the code. A lot of people have issues with their movie files. So this is the movie class, which is basically what's being used to represent movies in terms of their IDs and their titles. And this is what's passed back and forth between the client side and the server side. Some people just didn't implement it at all, so make sure you find it and implement it. There's something important missing here that you need to have. And if you don't have it, then other things are likely to be amiss. Down here, this person just didn't implement anything at all, so make sure you implement the methods here, which of course are going to be implemented by what's defined in the interface that's missing here, so make sure you put those things in here. And if you don't implement that interface, then you're going to get yourself in problems because you're not going to implement the right methods with the right names and the right signatures. So this is not the way to do the compare method. You want to implement the compare to method, which is what comes from the interface that's inherited. And I think it also takes an object, not a movie. Leaving that aside, this code isn't really going to be null safe. So if for some strange reason ID becomes null, which shouldn't happen, but you got to be prepared for it, this code will just kind of crash. So what you want to do instead is do some other way that will check for nulls. And I don't recommend you do assertions because that'll cause your code to break in a way that's probably overly dramatic. Here's a nice, cool way to do this where you use this comparator nulls first factor method with the string compare to ignore case parameter, which will make you a null safe string comparator. And then you can say null safe string comparator dot compare, and then that will properly handle nulls in a nice way. And it'll also, of course, ignore case. Here's another issue of having the wrong method signature. This should be object, not movie for equals. And this implementation is inadequate. We'll talk about why it's inadequate in a moment. Here's the right signature, but this implementation is too complicated, and there's a bunch of different ways people made them too complicated. Here's a much cleaner way to do this, where you simply say return object instance of movie other, where other, of course, is then the name if it does the type safe downcast, and then we say objects equals this ID, other ID. That also will check for null, so we don't have to worry about null problems breaking the code. Coming down here, same kind of problem, just too complicated. We don't need to do stuff like this. Now here's something that's very important to add. Make sure that you add the hash code method. Don't omit it, otherwise other things won't work. And number two, once you have the hash code method, all you need to do is hash on the ID, not the vector. You don't need to hash on the vector. That isn't going to make it, it just makes it a lot slower for no real benefit because we really just care about the title. Now let's start getting into the repository, the database repository file, and a lot of issues here. First of all, the whole point of this file is to be able to learn how to use the Spring Data API. So don't start writing explicit queries here. While that's possible to do, and in some cases it's useful, in this case it's not useful, and instead you should make sure you use the right name for this method, in which case Spring will generate the query for you automatically. And this name is incorrect, just like this name is incorrect. There is no title field or column in the movie object, so make sure that you do the right thing there. Same thing down here, there's no title field. You need to use the right field. You also need to make sure that you actually embed the proper keywords into the Spring Data API methods you define. So defining search and get movies doesn't mean anything to the Spring Data API, so this is completely pointless and useless. Won't do anything at all. So make sure that you go back and rewatch the video where we talk about how to do the Spring Data API. Now we're moving into the database service implementation. And once again, the whole point of using this kind of stuff here with the Spring Data API is so that down here, all we need to do is just forward some of these methods directly to the repository, which does all the work. So writing this manually by doing something with sorting by ID, find all, blah, 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 just completely missing the point. So do something simple. That's the whole point of this. Down here, interesting question. There's a question that occurs on Piazza where someone was talking about the don't repeat yourself principle, and I responded with a Socratic response. I haven't seen a response to my Socratic response yet, but let me talk about what the issue is. So in the previous assignments, we were implementing the search method by bundling up the query string, making it into a singleton list, and then passing it to the other method that did the actual searching. And there's some virtue in doing that because it required us not to have to write a lot of extra code. However, when we start taking a look at this example, this scenario, the search method here that takes a list of strings is actually much more complicated than simply forwarding to the appropriate database repository method that does the search. And since we didn't have to write any extra code here other than just forwarding it to the repository, it doesn't make any sense to take a very simple thing and replace it with something that's actually going to be much more inefficient. So that's part number one. But part number two is, as we'll see here in a second, if you really do want to abide by the dry principle, the don't repeat yourself principle, the way to do it is in this method by calling back to the method up here, the one that takes a query that's a string. And so let's take a look and see how this could work. First thing to note, make sure you read the specification comments carefully. This implementation, which uses stream, doesn't fulfill the specification comment which said to use a parallel stream, number one. Number two, and I only realized this myself, so my fault as much as anything, you can't use flat map with parallel streams for a wide range of reasons. If you want to understand why you can't use flat map with parallel streams, go watch this video here, the link that's shown there, which explains the issue. And it also talks about the map multi method, which was added, I think, in Java 16 to work around this weird quirk with flat map. So a much better way to implement this, which will actually use a parallel stream, is to replace this flat map stuff with this map multi operation. And what we're doing here is we're saying map multi, which takes in the string, which is the query, because we're having a stream of queries, and it also takes a consumer that consumes movies. And this is how we're going to take each of these elements and put them into the stream that's going to be emitted from map multi. And so what we do here is we call back to search. Now remember, this is the search that we defined above. So here is our don't repeat yourself principle being applied. So we call search on the query, which will go query the database, give back a list of things that match that query. And then for each element in that list, we hand it off to the consumer, which will put it into the stream that's being created. So that's a much cleaner and more efficient way of doing things. Don't use flat map. And down here, this is the place to apply the dry principle. And of course, I've incorporated it up into the map multi-call above. So we're still using dry. We're just using dry in a place that actually makes sense rather than slowing everything down. And then down here, this is just a way too complicated implementation of search for a list of queries, whereas you can see here, it's creating a set, and then it's doing something with a comparing, the sorted, blah, 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 blah. Way, way, way too complicated, and don't need to do stuff like that. Down here, once again, no need to use map followed by flat map. In fact, don't use map followed by flat map because it won't parallelize properly, but instead use the map multi. Of course, you have to remember after you do this stuff, and I haven't shown this here, but most people got this right, you have to use distinct followed by sorted, or sorted followed by distinct. I don't think it really makes that much difference which one you use, but the long and the short of it is that you want to make sure that you get rid of duplicates and make sure things are sorted, and then convert that into a list. So that's the walkthrough of frequently made mistakes for assignment 2A to this point. There, of course, will be undoubtedly another video that comes out after the assignment. But the key thing to remember, and I'll post this when I am done with rendering the videos today, very important to make sure you address all of these issues in your code before you submit it. I have reviewed everybody's code that has been submitted up to this point, so you all have these comments in your code. I don't have to re-review your code, but if you haven't pushed your code yet, make sure you address these issues, because if you don't, I'm not going to review your code. We already did the review here, so these are things you should be able to trivially fix on your own.